The storm had been raging for hours, its howling winds slashing against the windows of the old house. Nestled on the outskirts of town, the house had always been a source of fascination for anyone who dared to venture near it. With its crooked structure, dark windows, and an unsettling air that seemed to emanate from the very walls, the house was a magnet for rumors and whispered tales. Perfect for a getaway, Laura had said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. She had always been the adventurous one. When she suggested they spend the weekend in the house, it had been difficult for the others to resist. The excitement of a secluded retreat was tempting, especially after the stressful weeks they had all endured. Laura, along with her friends, Anna, Sarah, and Tom, had arrived earlier that afternoon, but by the time the storm had settled in, the mood had shifted from excitement to unease. None of them were prepared for what awaited them inside. The door had creaked when they entered, a low, groaning sound that seemed to set the tone for the entire evening. The air smelled of old wood and mildew, and the floorboards creaked with every step they took. The living room was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb that flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows against the walls. There were portraits on the walls, old ones, their faces obscured by the passage of time and dust. It almost felt as if the house was watching them. "Do you think anyone actually lives here?" Anna asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Probably not," Tom replied, brushing past her and plopping onto the worn-out couch. "It's a fixer-upper. No one has bothered with it in ages." "Why'd it come so cheap, then?" Sarah asked, her tone sharp as she followed him inside. "This place is unsettling." "You're just being paranoid," Laura said, forcing a smile. "It's just an old house. I'm sure nothing weird is going to happen." But there was something in the air that none of them could ignore. It wasn't just the decaying structure or the flickering lights. It was the sense that something was wrong. Something that hadn't been right for a long time. As night fell, the storm outside only worsened, adding to the sense of isolation. They tried to distract themselves with conversation and games, but the atmosphere in the house made everything feel hollow and forced. Tom tried to lighten the mood by cracking jokes, but even his usual bravado faltered under the weight of the oppressive silence that filled the space. After a few hours, they decided to explore the house. The upstairs was even more dismal than the downstairs, with narrow hallways and rooms that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Dust-covered furniture stood in the corners of the rooms, and the air was thick with the staleness of years of neglect. "I'm not sure I like this," Anna whispered, her voice trembling as she peered into one of the rooms. It was dark, almost suffocating, and the only sound was the wind howling outside. The room had an overwhelming feeling of emptiness, as though no one had ever truly lived there. Laura, ever the brave one, led the group through the darkened corridors, her steps echoing through the house. As they walked, the house seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping with each step they took. A strange, eerie feeling crept up on them, one that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. The others froze, straining their ears. There was a faint sound coming from the floor above, a soft shuffling noise, like footsteps. "I think we should go back," Anna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nonsense," Laura replied, though her voice was now more uncertain. "It's just the wind, or maybe some critters." But the shuffling continued, growing louder. Something, or someone, was up there. Tom, who had been the most skeptical of all, now looked uneasy. "I don't like this. Let's head back downstairs." They turned, but as they did, the door to the room at the end of the hall slammed shut with a violent bang. The sound echoed through the house, making their hearts race. "What the hell was that?" Sarah exclaimed, her breath coming in short gasps. "I think it's time to go," Anna said, her voice shaky now. "We shouldn't have come here." But Laura, still determined to prove there was nothing wrong, marched up to the door and turned the handle. The door opened slowly, revealing a small, dusty room that seemed almost forgotten by time. The walls were lined with shelves that held nothing but cobwebs and broken furniture. There was nothing threatening about it, but the feeling of dread in the air was palpable. "See?" "Nothing," Laura said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. But just as she was about to turn away, a strange noise came from the corner of the room, a low, grinding sound. All of them froze. It was as though something in the room had shifted. Laura took a step closer, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could respond, the light bulb above them flickered violently, casting the room in an eerie, stuttering glow. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. Tom, now visibly shaken, backed away from the room. "I don't know about you guys, but I've had enough. Let's just get out of here." As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash. They all jumped, their hearts pounding in their chests. "I think it's time we leave. This place is cursed," Anna said, voice trembling as she pulled at the door handle. But it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling through the broken windows. The house groaned and creaked under the pressure, as though it were alive, resisting their attempts to leave. Laura pushed against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Come on. Let's get out of here." But the door wouldn't open. The door remained stubbornly shut, no matter how hard Laura pushed. She threw her shoulder against it, her face turning red with effort, but the door wouldn't budge. "What's happening?" Anna's voice cracked, panic taking root in her words. "It's not just the door, there's something wrong with this place." Tom was pacing, his eyes darting toward the corners of the room as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. "This is insane. There's no way we're stuck in here. There's got to be another way out. Maybe we can break a window." Sarah was on the verge of tears now. What if something's watching us? What if we're not alone?" Her voice quivered with a growing fear, and her wide, frantic eyes reflected the dim light from the hallway. "I don't know," Laura admitted, her usual bravado failing her for the first time since they'd entered. "But I'm not just going to stand here. There has to be something, some way, out of this room." Without thinking, she turned toward the window. The storm outside raged even louder now, the wind slamming against the glass, the rain driving in sheets. But the glass itself appeared to be perfectly intact. It wasn't cracked or broken. It was as if the house itself had sealed them in. Tom walked over to her, his steps quick and deliberate. "Let me try," he said, more out of necessity than confidence. His face was pale, and his hand shook as he reached for the window latch. He gave it a hard twist, but the window didn't open. It was locked from the outside. Laura stepped back, her mind racing. It was impossible. It was like they were trapped in this room, in this house, with no way out. She couldn't understand how the door had closed behind them or why the window wouldn't open. All she could feel was that growing weight, a sense of suffocation that settled in her chest. "This can't be happening," she muttered to herself. "Do you guys feel that?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice small but tense. "The temperature, it's colder. So much colder than it was just a minute ago." Anna shivered and nodded. "I thought I was going crazy. I felt it too. What is going on?" But no one could answer. The air around them seemed to shift again, growing more oppressive with every passing second. The sound of the wind outside, the howling storm, was drowned out by the steady hum of something deeper, something older, almost primal. Laura turned toward the center of the room, her eyes scanning the dark corners once again. The walls seemed to pulse as if alive, vibrating with an energy she couldn't explain. That's when she saw it. In the far corner of the room, behind an old armoire that had been pushed against the wall, there was a shape. It was barely visible, almost a shadow, but it was unmistakable. A figure, just standing there, unmoving, as though it had been waiting for them. "Guys," she whispered, her voice thick with dread. "Do you see that?" Everyone turned toward the corner, and for a brief moment, it felt like time itself had frozen. Then, Sarah gasped. That wasn't there before," she said, her voice trembling. The figure was humanoid in shape, but it wasn't a person. Not exactly. It was a dark, shifting silhouette, its edges jagged and unnatural. The longer they stared at it, the more distorted it seemed, as if it was struggling to maintain any form at all. "I don't think it's real," Anna said quietly, her voice shaking as she backed away. "It's not real. It can't be." Tom, however, took a step forward, his hand outstretched as though he were daring the thing to move. "What the hell is that?" "It looks like a shadow, but it's too solid." As if in response to his words, the figure shifted. Slowly, almost deliberately, it slid forward. The air grew colder still, and Laura could see her breath misting in front of her face. "I don't like this," she muttered, stepping backward as the figure inched closer. Suddenly, the armoire slammed open with a deafening crash. The shadowy form lunged toward them. But before anyone could react, a deafening bang sounded from behind them. It was as if a gunshot had pierced the room, a violent blast that rattled the very foundation of the house. "What the hell was that?" Tom shouted, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. The figure in the corner froze, its motion arrested as if it had been caught mid-stride. And then, as if sensing their panic, it vanished, disappearing into the shadows like smoke caught in a gust of wind. They all stood there, frozen, too afraid to speak, too afraid to even breathe. "What was that?" Anna's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know," Laura replied, her own voice tight with fear. "But I don't think we're alone here." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, shallow and quick. The storm outside continued its violent assault on the house, but now it seemed distant, insignificant compared to the strange and unsettling events that had just unfolded in front of them. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Now." The words hung in the air, but none of them moved. None of them could. The house seemed to be holding them captive, trapping them in this room, in this nightmare. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in, closing them off from any escape. Laura stepped forward again, determined. "Let's find another way out," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. Tom was already heading for the door again, his hand grasping the handle. "This is getting out of hand. There's got to be a back exit or something." He twisted the knob, but the door didn't open. Again. "Why won't it open?" Anna asked, her voice now on the edge of hysteria. "Why is this happening? What the hell is going on?" As if answering her question, the house responded. A low growl emanated from deep within the walls, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the windows. The walls began to hum louder, and the temperature dropped even further, sending sharp, icy pangs through their skin. "Guys, look!" Sarah suddenly screamed, pointing to the ceiling. A dark mass was slowly forming above them, a shifting, swirling blackness that seemed to grow by the second. It was a cloud, or maybe smoke, but it wasn't natural. It pulsed and shifted, moving in unnatural patterns, like it was alive. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. "It's trying to trap us here," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "It wants us to stay. We need to leave now." Anna yelled, her voice breaking with desperation. But the house was fighting them. Every step they took seemed to bring them deeper into its grasp. The walls pressed closer together, and the air grew thicker, almost suffocating. They were running out of time. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the house seemed to come alive. A loud crash echoed from upstairs, and the entire structure shook as though it were about to collapse. The swirling mass above them began to move faster, almost violently now, like a vortex pulling everything in. "This is it," Tom muttered. "We're not getting out of here alive." The realization hit them all at once: this wasn't just a haunted house. This was something far worse. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. And the worst part? It was only just getting started. The house felt alive, its dark heart beating in sync with their terror. Every creak, every groan from the walls seemed to draw them deeper into the nightmare, and every breath felt like it might be their last. The swirling mass above them, now thick and black as pitch, seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm. The temperature had plummeted even further, and they could see their breath rising in wisps of fog before them. "We're not going to survive this," Sarah whimpered, her voice breaking as she took a step back from the swirling black cloud that hovered over them like a predator waiting to pounce. She was shaking so violently that she could barely stand, her body trembling with a fear so deep it had rooted her to the spot. "We need to find a way out," Laura said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none to be found. The door, the windows, all of it was locked, sealed as though the house itself had decided to trap them. Tom moved toward the stairs, his eyes wild with panic. "There has to be another exit. Maybe upstairs. I'll check." "No." Anna cried, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. "Don't go near the stairs. That thing we saw in the corner, it's up there. It's watching us. It knows we're here." "I don't care," Tom snapped, his voice raw with fear. "I'm not staying in here with this thing." He pointed up at the swirling mass, now moving in jagged, erratic patterns. As if in response, the house shook again, the walls rattling with a deafening force that nearly knocked them off their feet. The black cloud above them started to move more rapidly, its shape shifting and swirling, becoming more solid with each passing second. "Stop!" Laura shouted, grabbing Tom by the shoulders. "We have to stick together. We can't go off alone. It'll pick us off one by one." He pulled away from her, his face pale and frantic. "We're already dead, Laura. You saw what happened. It's all over. We're just—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes wide with horror. The swirling mass above them had stopped moving. In that moment, everything went quiet. Too quiet. The air felt thick, suffocating. The hum from the walls had stopped, the storm outside seemed to mute, and even the sound of their breathing felt like it came from far away. For a moment, there was only the silence. A silence that was far more terrifying than any sound they had heard before. Then, a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." It echoed through the room, sending chills down their spines. The voice was neither male nor female. It didn't even sound human. It was cold, hollow, as if it had been waiting for centuries to speak. "What is that?" Anna gasped, her face drained of color. "It's not real," Tom said, though his voice cracked. He didn't believe it. No one believed it. But none of them dared to speak. "Not yet. You're all mine now." The voice came again, louder this time, and as it did, the black cloud above them seemed to surge forward, descending rapidly. It moved with a speed that was almost impossible to follow, like a storm unleashed, crashing down toward them. The temperature dropped again, and this time, it wasn't just cold, it was freezing. Their breath came in short bursts as they fought to stay standing. The walls felt as if they were closing in, pushing them toward the center of the room. There was no escape. No way out. It was suffocating. "Run!" Laura screamed, her voice hoarse. "Get out of here." She turned and bolted toward the door, but the moment her hand touched the handle, it felt as though the entire house pressed against her, trapping her in place. It was as if the air itself had turned to stone, holding her fast. "Laura, no!" Sarah screamed, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "It's no use. The house won't let us go. It wants us here. It's feeding off our fear." The truth of it hit Laura like a punch to the gut. She'd known something was wrong with this place from the moment they entered. But it wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. It was alive, and it was hungry. They all backed away from the door, fear and panic clouding their thoughts. They had no idea what to do, how to escape. They were trapped, helpless. A shadow shifted in the corner of the room. "I can feel your fear." The voice was so close now that it seemed to reverberate through their very bones. Then, from the darkness, the figure appeared again. The shadow, no longer just a form, but a creature, twisted and contorted, crawling toward them with unnatural speed. Its body was made of darkness, its face an empty void, a gaping maw of endless blackness. Its presence was suffocating, pulling the air from the room, making it hard to breathe. It was a thing of nightmare, born of the house's malice, and it was closing in on them. "Run!" Laura screamed again, though the words felt empty. Where could they run? They bolted toward the staircase, though none of them believed it would help. It was only a desperate attempt, a way to avoid the horror that was creeping toward them. They dashed up the narrow stairs, the old wood creaking beneath their feet as though the house itself were protesting their every movement. The air grew thicker the higher they climbed, and the further they went, the more oppressive the feeling became. The top of the stairs opened into a dark hallway lined with old, rotting doors. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, reaching out toward them like claws. "This way!" Tom shouted, pointing to a door at the end of the hallway. It was cracked open, revealing only blackness beyond. But as they rushed toward the door, the house shifted again. The ground trembled, and the walls groaned with a deep, rumbling sound, like the sound of something massive moving beneath them. It was like the house was alive, and it was trying to eat them. Without thinking, they rushed into the room, slamming the door behind them. It was pitch black inside, save for the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through a grimy window. For a moment, they stood in silence, gasping for breath, each of them trying to steady their trembling hands. "I don't know what's happening," Anna said, her voice trembling as she stared into the darkness. "I don't know what's real anymore." "We need to get out," Laura said, forcing the words through a throat tight with fear. "We just need to find a way out." But just as she spoke, the door behind them slammed shut. The force of it was enough to knock them all off balance, sending them tumbling to the floor. The room was now completely dark. "Please," Sarah whispered. "I just want to go home. I don't want to be here anymore." And just then, they heard it. A whisper. A low, rasping breath in the dark. "You will never leave." The whisper echoed through the darkness, curling around them like a tangible thing. "You will never leave." Laura's breath hitched in her throat as she scrambled to her feet. She couldn't see anything. The room was pitch black, the oppressive darkness so thick it felt as though it were swallowing her whole. "Is anyone else hearing that?" Anna asked, her voice strained, barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. Laura nodded, even though no one could see it. "I heard it. I heard it too." There was something in the air. It wasn't just cold, it was suffocating, pressing against their skin, filling their lungs with dread. Laura reached out, groping for something, anything, she could use to anchor herself in the chaos of her racing thoughts. But there was nothing. No walls. No furniture. No escape. Then the whisper came again, louder this time. "You will never leave." Sarah's breathing turned frantic. "It's getting closer," she whimpered, backing into the corner of the room. "It's in here. It's right next to us." Laura's eyes darted around in the dark. She felt something, an unnatural presence, hovering just beyond her reach. The temperature had dropped even more, and now it felt as though they were trapped in a vacuum, the air impossibly thick, as if the very room was closing in on them. I can't take it anymore, Tom muttered, his voice hoarse. He pushed himself forward, his footsteps shaky. I'm getting out of here. I don't care what happens. I can't stay in this place another second. Before anyone could stop him, Tom threw open the door and stepped into the hallway. The moment he crossed the threshold, the house seemed to groan in protest. The sound echoed through the walls, a deep, rumbling growl that made Laura's skin crawl. Tom, no. Laura screamed, but it was too late. Tom was already gone. A moment of heavy silence passed before the house responded. From the hallway came a scream, a sharp, guttural cry that made Laura's blood run cold. It was Tom's scream. It didn't sound human. Tom! Anna shrieked, her voice high with panic. She rushed toward the door, but Laura grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back. No, Laura said, her voice shaking. Don't go out there. We can't save him. We can't help him now. But Anna twisted in her grip, her face filled with terror and denial. No. We have to, he's out there, he's. The scream stopped as suddenly as it had started. Then came the laughter. It was low, guttural, filled with malice. The laughter echoed through the house, reverberating from the walls, from the ceiling, as though it were coming from every direction. It twisted and distorted, rising higher and higher until it became unbearable. The air seemed to vibrate with it. He's mine now. The voice came again, low and final. And you will join him. Laura's blood ran cold. No, she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Not again. Not like this. The walls seemed to pulse, and for a moment, the darkness that enveloped them became so thick, so oppressive, that it felt like the room was crushing them. She gasped for air, but it was as if there was none to be had. Her chest tightened, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst. The temperature was unbearable now, freezing her to the bone, her breath coming out in sharp, ragged gasps. We can't stay here, Sarah said, her voice hoarse. We need to get out. We need to get out now. But Laura knew there was no escape. Not anymore. In that moment, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. The walls moved, creaking and groaning, stretching and twisting like they were alive, shifting and changing. The once solid structure was becoming something else entirely, something far darker, more terrifying. There was a sense of something ancient and powerful, something that had been lying dormant, waiting for them. It wasn't just the house, it was something deeper, something older, buried in the very foundations of the place. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting long, spindly shadows across the room. The darkness stretched out, crawling along the floor, the walls, reaching toward them. The shadows swarmed, coiling and twisting like living things. From the corner of the room, something moved. It was a figure, a shadowy, indistinct shape that seemed to grow with every passing second. As it drew closer, the shape solidified into something more grotesque, a twisted, contorted version of a human, its limbs elongated and unnatural, its face a mask of decay and suffering. It had the same empty void where its eyes should be, and its mouth, wide and gaping, seemed to be filled with blackness that pulled at the very air around it. You will join me. The voice, low and terrible, came from the creature's mouth. It was the same voice they'd heard earlier, the one that had promised they would never leave. Please, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. Please, just let us go. But there was no mercy in that thing's eyes. There was only darkness, endless darkness, and a hunger that could never be satisfied. The creature lunged toward them with inhuman speed, its twisted form streaking across the room, its mouth opening wider, 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 until it was nothing but a void, ready to consume them whole. The house trembled again, louder now. The entire structure seemed to be shaking, as though it were alive, as though it were responding to their fear. We need to run. Laura shouted, though she wasn't sure where they could run to. There was no escape. The house had them, and they knew it. But as they turned to flee, the walls closed in on them. The door slammed shut with a violent crash, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The floor buckled, groaning under the weight of something terrible. From behind them, the creature's laugh filled the room, its terrible, guttural sound reverberating through their bones. And then the lights went out. The darkness swallowed them whole. Laura's heartbeat rang in her ears as she staggered through the pitch black, disoriented and gasping for breath. She couldn't see anything, couldn't even tell if her eyes were open. Every step she took felt like an eternity, the cold, suffocating air pressing down on her chest with each movement. "We're trapped," she thought, her mind struggling to process the terror that was suffusing every inch of her being. She reached out, but her hands brushed against nothing. It was as if the house itself had vanished, leaving only endless emptiness behind. She stumbled forward, her legs unsteady, until she felt something, a cold, smooth surface beneath her fingers. A wall. Her mind tried to latch onto this sensation, but it offered no comfort. Every sound, every whisper in the blackness felt amplified, as though the house itself was alive, watching her, listening. And then, a shift. The air, thick and heavy with fear, seemed to crackle with energy. A faint pulse, almost imperceptible, vibrated beneath her feet. She froze, holding her breath. The pulse came again, stronger this time, followed by a low, guttural hum. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had been waiting. Before she could react, a light, dim and flickering, appeared in the distance. It was soft at first, like the faint glow of a dying ember, but it grew brighter with each step she took. Maybe it's an exit, she thought, desperate for any sign of salvation. She pushed herself toward it, her legs moving faster now, spurred by a shred of hope. The darkness around her felt suffocating, but with each step toward the light, it began to loosen, as if she was being pulled from some nightmare. As she neared the glow, it brightened, revealing an open doorway, the way out. She felt her pulse race in relief as she reached for the threshold. But just before she could step through, a cold hand grasped her arm, pulling her back. She whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. In the doorway stood a figure, twisted and contorted, its face hidden in shadow. It spoke, its voice like the scraping of nails on stone. "You can't leave." The light flickered one last time, and then everything went dark.